Eleanor Grace was known in Silver Creek Estates as the kind of woman who seemed to belong to another world. Her house stood tall, with white pillars and a driveway filled with sleek cars. Neighbors often saw her trimming her roses, offering a smile and a gentle wave. She lived with quiet dignity, never interfering with others, and when someone was in need, she was always the first to step forward. If a child scraped their knee, Eleanor had bandages. If a family was struggling, she sent over meals. People admired her, but also whispered behind her back. For all her wealth and her charm, she was utterly alone. No husband, no family, no visitors. The mystery of her loneliness became the opening her enemies needed. The HOA board, already notorious for their strict rules, began to notice. Without a husband, without children, Eleanor had no shield. Slowly, they turned their gaze on her. It began with little notes. Your trash can was left out past the allowed time. Fine, $50. Then it grew. Your rose bushes extend beyond regulation height. Fine, $200. One day, she received a notice claiming her porch light was not the right shade of white. Another week, they accused her of parking her own car slightly over the edge of her driveway line. The fines piled up, each more absurd than the last. Eleanor paid them quietly at first, believing it would stop, but it never did. One evening, she attended a meeting to defend herself. The board sat behind a long table, faces smug with power. Mrs. Grace, Harold Benson, the HOA president, began, "Your repeated violations show a disregard for community standards." Eleanor's voice trembled, but remained steady. "I've broken no real rules. You invent them for me alone. Why?" The board members exchanged knowing glances, but offered no answer. Eleanor realized then that they were circling her like vultures. Her kindness was mistaken for weakness, her solitude for helplessness. The cruelty intensified. They issued threats that her home could be seized if fines went unpaid. They claimed her lawn decorations were unapproved structures. They spread rumors that she was unstable. Residents began avoiding her, fearful of being targeted themselves. Yet Eleanor endured. Inside, however, fear gnawed at her. She had lost her son years ago, declared dead after disappearing during a mission with his unit. She had buried her grief alone, clinging to her home as the only place where his memory remained. The HOA wanted to strip even that from her. One night, when the pressure became unbearable, Eleanor made a bold move. At the next meeting, she appeared with documents in hand. Calmly, she laid them on the table before the board. "You will not harass me any longer. My son lives. He is my heir. This home is his as much as mine." The board froze as she presented a marriage certificate and records linking her to a son they thought long dead. In reality, Eleanor had carefully forged the papers, weaving a lie of survival. She claimed her boy had been part of a special SWAAT unit lost in the river 5 years ago. His body had never been found, but she insisted he lived on. The government may have declared him dead, but to her, and now to the HOA, he was alive. The board exchanged uneasy glances. If she had a son, especially one with a military background, she was no longer an easy target. Harold Benson's smile faltered for the first time. Eleanor met their eyes, fire in her voice. "This house is my son's legacy. Touch it and you will regret it." The meeting ended in silence. The HOA retreated, shaken. Eleanor returned home that night with a flicker of victory. But deep down, she knew her lie was fragile. She had only bought herself time. Somewhere in her heart, she still prayed her real son was alive. Somewhere. Somehow. 5 years had passed since Eleanor's desperate bluff before the HOA. In another state, far from Silver Creek Estates, a couple named Robert and Margaret Lawson were spending a quiet weekend by the river. They were both in their mid-40s, childless, but deeply devoted to one another. Robert loved fishing, while Margaret enjoyed simply sitting on the dock with a book, letting the sound of water soothe her. That evening, as the sun began to dip low, Robert's line snagged on something heavy beneath the current. He pulled hard, thinking it was a branch, but then he saw it. A man's body drifting slowly, battered and broken, barely clinging to life. Margaret screamed for help as Robert dragged the stranger to shore. His skin was pale, his uniform torn, scars running across his arms and chest. He was unconscious, his breath shallow, his body trembling from blood loss and exhaustion. Robert pressed his ear against his chest. A faint heartbeat. Still alive. "We need to get him to a hospital. Now!" Margaret cried. They rushed him in their truck, tires skidding over gravel as the man groaned faintly in the back seat. At the nearest small-town hospital, doctors worked frantically, but their resources were limited. After hours of emergency treatment, the head doctor stepped out with grim news. "He needs advanced care. We don't have the equipment. You must take him to the state hospital, immediately, or he won't make it through the night." The Lawsons didn't hesitate. They signed the transfer papers themselves and drove the stranger through the night, Margaret holding his hand, whispering, "Stay with us. Please, don't give up." His eyes flickered once, just enough for her to see their deep brown color before he sank back into silence. At the state hospital, he was admitted directly into the intensive care unit. Surgeons worked for hours repairing internal damage, treating infections, and stabilizing him. When it was done, the doctor approached Robert and Margaret with heavy eyes. He survived surgery, but his condition is critical. He's in a coma. His chances are uncertain. Days turned to weeks. The man did not wake. Robert visited daily, speaking to him as though he were an old friend. "I don't know who you are, son, but you fought hard to stay alive. If you pulled through this, I promise you, you won't be alone." Margaret prayed by his bedside, brushing his hair back, whispering encouragement. The nurses called him the River Soldier, since no one knew his name. Months passed, then years. Still, the man remained in a coma, his body alive, but his mind locked away. Robert and Margaret never abandoned him. They visited on birthdays and holidays, decorating his hospital room with cards, flowers, and small gifts. They read books aloud, hoping their voices might reach him somewhere in the silence. Other patients came and went, but the soldier remained, a fixture of resilience and mystery. On the third year, something changed. Margaret was reading softly from a novel when she noticed his hand twitch. At first she thought she imagined it, but then his fingers moved again. "Robert!" she cried, her voice breaking with joy. Doctors rushed in as machines beeped rapidly. The man's eyes opened for the first time in years, glassy and confused, but alive. He tried to speak, but no words came. His voice was broken, his memory a shattered mirror. He did not know where he was. He did not know who he was. He could not even recall his own name. Yet Robert and Margaret smiled through tears. To them, it did not matter. He was alive, and he was theirs now. Recovery was slow, but every small step felt like a miracle. The man who had once been lifeless on the riverbank was now walking again, speaking in fragments, and learning to smile. He could not remember his name, his past, or the battles that had scarred his body, but Robert and Margaret refused to let him face the world alone. They gave him a new beginning. At first, he lived with them in their spacious country home. Margaret cooked meals for him, patiently teaching him simple words and helping him rebuild his memory. Robert, proud but gentle, became his teacher in discipline, showing him how to work with tools, drive, and handle responsibility. Slowly, the soldier began to stitch together pieces of who he was. He remembered flashes of water rushing over him, the sound of gunfire, and the echo of a woman's voice, soft, loving, calling him my son. But when he tried to grasp the memory, it slipped away like mist. Robert and Margaret grew attached to him as though he were their own child. They had longed for a family, but had been denied the chance. Now, fate had placed this broken man in their care, and they loved him fiercely. "You don't need to remember who you were," Margaret often told him, brushing his hair back like a mother would. "You're ours now." Years passed, and with them came change. Robert and Margaret were wealthy beyond measure, owners of a vast company that quietly held influence across multiple states. Their business stretched into construction, real estate, and even the management of exclusive communities. They introduced the soldier, whom they now called Daniel, into their world. Daniel proved a quick learner. Despite his missing past, he was disciplined, strategic, and sharp. Within 2 years, he was running major parts of their company. People admired his leadership, his quiet strength, and his sense of justice. But fate can be cruel in its timing. Robert fell ill one winter and passed quietly in his sleep. Margaret followed, just months later, unable to bear the loneliness. Before they died, they left everything to Daniel, their fortune, their company, their empire. For the first time in his life, Daniel stood not as a lost man, but as the head of a vast and powerful legacy. And yet, with power came questions. Late at night, when the house was quiet, memories would return in fragments. He would see flashes of a younger version of himself in uniform, standing proudly with other soldiers. He would hear the sound of rushing water, the weight of a river dragging him under. He would feel the aching sorrow of a woman's voice crying out, "Come back to me." Daniel began to search. Something deep within him told him there was unfinished business, a truth waiting to be uncovered. He traveled back to the river where Robert had first found him, speaking to old fishermen and locals. Most had no answers. He visited towns and villages, asking about missing soldiers, about families who had lost sons. The responses were vague, and each journey ended in disappointment. But Daniel pressed on, restless, as though a hand from the past was pulling him forward. Months turned into years. Still, he searched. Some said he was chasing a ghost, but Daniel knew better. Somewhere out there was the woman who haunted his dreams. Somewhere he had a home he had lost, and though he could not explain why, every clue seemed to circle back toward the world Robert and Margaret once ruled, the company, the estates, and the wealthy gated communities they controlled. One of them, he learned, was Silver Creek Estates. Daniel didn't yet know it, but the truth was waiting for him there. Silver Creek Estates was preparing for its grandest celebration in years. The HOA had been buzzing with excitement for weeks, plastering notices on doors, stringing banners across the gates, and hiring caterers, musicians, and decorators. The event was meant to honor the arrival of the new business magnate, who had recently taken full control of the company that owned not just their society, but dozens of others across the state. None of the residents knew much about him, only that he was powerful, wealthy beyond imagination, and heavily guarded. The HOA president, Mrs. Carter, was especially eager. Her reputation depended on this party. She barked orders at committee members, demanded perfection from every vendor, and rehearsed her welcoming speech 100 times in the mirror. She did not know that fate was about to play a cruel trick on her. On the night of the event, Silver Creek Estates glowed with lights. Elegant cars lined the streets. Music filled the air, and residents dressed in their finest clothes gathered in anticipation. A convoy of black SUVs rolled up to the gates, engines rumbling in unison. Guards stepped out first, scanning the area with cold precision. Then, from the central car, a tall figure emerged, calm, poised, commanding respect without saying a word. It was Daniel. The crowd erupted in polite applause as Mrs. Carter nearly stumbled over herself to greet him. "Welcome, sir, welcome! We are honored by your presence," she gushed, bowing slightly as though he were royalty. Daniel offered only a small nod before moving toward the stage. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd, but he did not linger on anyone. To him, it was just another event, another performance in the role he now carried. He delivered a short speech about unity, growth, and the importance of community. His voice was steady, his presence magnetic. The residents listened in awe. Afterward, as the party carried on, Daniel insisted on touring the society. "I want to see the people, their homes, the life they've built here," he told Mrs. Carter. Nervous but thrilled to be in his company, she hurried to lead the way. They walked down quiet streets, past rows of manicured lawns and grand houses. Then something caught Daniel's eye. A small brass nameplate on a modest home, half hidden by vines. He stopped in his tracks. His breath caught. Etched into the metal was a name that struck him like lightning: Eleanor. His pulse quickened. He turned to a nearby resident and asked, his voice unusually sharp, "Who lives here?" The neighbor, surprised by his intensity, replied, "An older woman. She's lived here for years. Keeps to herself mostly. Kind lady, but the HOA gives her trouble now and then." Daniel stared at the door for a long moment. His heart pounded in his chest. With trembling hands, he pressed the bell. The sound echoed inside. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the door creaked open. A woman appeared, her hair silvered with age, her eyes tired yet warm. The moment Daniel saw her face, something deep within him broke free. Memory surged like a flood. The voice calling him son, the warm touch of her hand, the nights of laughter long ago. He staggered forward, whispering in disbelief, "Mother!" Eleanor froze, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. For years she had grieved, convinced her boy had been lost forever to the river. And now, standing before her, was the face she had prayed for every night. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered back, "My son, you came back to me." They embraced each other, clinging to one another as though time itself had been conquered. Neighbors gathered in stunned silence, watching the reunion unfold. Mrs. Carter, the proud HOA president, felt the color drain from her face. The powerful man she had hoped to impress was the very son of the woman she had tormented for years. Her knees buckled as she muttered apologies, but her words dissolved into the night, meaningless in the face of the truth. The night that had begun as a display of power and pride turned into something no one in Silver Creek Estates would ever forget. Daniel stood in front of his mother's house, holding her as if he were afraid she might vanish again. Eleanor's tears soaked into his suit, her hands trembling as they clutched his shoulders. Neighbors whispered among themselves, struggling to process what they were witnessing. The man they had just cheered as a distant, untouchable figure of authority was suddenly human before their eyes, a son who had found his lost mother. Eleanor pulled back just enough to look at him, her voice breaking. "They told me you were gone. The government, the army, everyone said you drowned. But I knew in my heart you were out there somewhere. I never stopped praying for you." Daniel cupped her face in his hands, his own eyes shining. "I was gone for so long, Mother. I lost myself, but I found my way back to you. Nothing and no one will ever take me from you again." Behind them, Mrs. Carter stepped forward, her earlier arrogance replaced with sheer panic. She stammered, "Sir, please, I didn't know she was your mother. The rules, the fines, it was nothing personal. You must understand, I was only following procedure." Her voice cracked, desperate to salvage her reputation. Daniel turned to her slowly, his expression unreadable. The crowd fell silent, waiting for his response. He spoke calmly, but every word carried the weight of judgment. "Procedure? You tormented her because she was alone. You exploited her grief. You turned a community into a prison, and now you hide behind rules?" Mrs. Carter's knees nearly gave way. She lowered her head, mumbling apologies, but Daniel no longer looked at her. His attention returned to Eleanor. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders and said gently, "From this day forward, you will never face them alone again. This house, this society, this life, it's all yours to live in peace." Eleanor leaned against him, her heart lighter than it had been in decades. For the first time since losing her son, she felt whole. The neighbors, once complicit in silence, shifted uneasily. Some felt shame for not standing by Eleanor when she had needed them most. Others looked at Daniel with awe, realizing the man they had just cheered as a distant, untouchable figure of authority was suddenly human before their eyes, a son who had found his lost mother. As the night wore on, the grand party dissolved into murmurs and stunned silence. Guards stood watch, but their presence seemed unnecessary now. The real spectacle was not the grand convoy of luxury cars or the glittering decorations. It was the reunion of a mother and her son, a moment that silenced cruelty and humbled pride. Daniel walked his mother back inside her home, hand in hand. The brass nameplate on the door gleamed under the street light, no longer just a marker of loneliness, but a symbol of love reclaimed. Eleanor turned to him once more before stepping inside. "You've given me the greatest gift, my son. You came back." And as the door closed softly behind them, Silver Creek Estates felt the weight of a lesson it would never forget. Power could command respect, but love could move the heavens themselves.